And we'll begin with some perspectives of the industrialization of the North, which you will learn has an interesting, but in some senses not too uplifting history. So question is, what can we learn from the past? Here to start this theme of territorial evidence is Sverker Sörlin, professor in the Department of History of Science, Technology and Environment at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. He is also a very appreciated author and a long-standing policy advisor. So please give Sverker Sörlin a very warm welcome.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be in Luleå. I've been here many times before. I'm actually from the north myself, from Västerbotten that we heard about before the break. And it brings me great pleasure also to readdress some issues that I've been working on for a long time. And to do this for this esteemed audience is even more pleasurable. I want to start here in Paris, not London, but Paris. This moment of joy and satisfaction when the Paris Agreement was signed. And I do that because this is the framing kind of logic here. We want to achieve certain very, very good and acute things on the global level, on the planetary level. And we see the SDG goals, we know about them already, we can all maybe even cite all the 17. We have learned a lot. But it's not so easy to have that materialized in reality, and we are already way behind the schedule. So that's where the green industrialization in the North is fitting in. And it's already drawing a lot of debate. These are books that are about this issue in a sense. There are many others, and more will be forthcoming. A discussion is growing about what is going on and how it should be conducted, how to move forward on this. The Battery Factory, you could probably read it even though it's Swedish. The other is the title of my own doctoral dissertation back in 1988. Then there was no discussion about the green transition, I can tell you, in the 1980s. It's a very, very different mode of the North. I've continued to work on these kinds of issues for many years since then, on and off, not always, but I've moved further north in a sense. I've worked quite a lot of resource issues in the Arctic. These are a couple of things I've been involved in. Most recently, this book to the left, Resource Extraction in Arctic Communities. That image is from Svalbard and Spitsbergen. It's not, we talked about people before, not so many people there, but very much resource extraction. It's a more extreme environment, but part of a similar pattern. There are also futures involved here. The title of the other book had futures in the title. We are always interested in the future. And this is, and I will return to this theme this morning, that it's been a projection screen for a long time about various ideas of how to develop the North and where to arrive in the future. This is not a very realistic animation of this. It's a photo montage, but it represents one way of looking at the future, and there are certainly others. I find this a very entertaining kind of way of looking at the future. Behind it is the man down to the right there. His name was Vilhjálmur Stefansson. He was of Icelandic origin. His parents moved from Iceland to Canada and settled there, and he became a scholar and an explorer. And in a book with the title The Northward Course of Empire in 1922, he drew this graphic representation of what he conceived as civilization, how civilization would move further from the early civilizations in Babylon, Egypt and Sumer, moving towards the Middle East, towards Europe, across the Atlantic, towards North America, passing the big cities, New York, Montreal, and it would end up precisely in the place where his parents had settled, in Winnipeg, as you can see there. The colder, the more higher the civilization. That was his take on progress and civilization, the growth of civilization. We could say we find this very entertaining today and we laugh a little bit because that's not the way we think about it today. It was a determinist way of looking at the future. It was a preconceived idea that he thought, so to speak, metaphysically, that would materialize. I still think it is useful to look at these things. It's 100 years ago, but there are still some determinism often in a discussion about something. This must happen. It's bound to happen. We have to do it. We cannot not do it. I have the other perspective. I think this is an open issue. It's very important to look at the future as important and as something possible to discuss. But that was scholarship at the time. If we move halfway from then to now, we're in 1958. And this is actually in Norrbotten. This is Kiruna, the mining town, when they had hired Ralph Erskine, the British-born architect who worked for most of his career in Sweden, to design the city as it grew. Many of his buildings are now torn down, actually, because the city has been moving. But this was his vision. It's a modern city placed in a very Arctic place. It's a very modern place, too. You see already then the solar panels in 1958. He calls it an ecological town. You see the wind turbines. You see the what we perhaps could see as a sport facility. It's other buildings for a community to live together. You don't necessarily see very much of the mining. It's also a friendly cohabitation with the local population. You see the reindeer. You see the reindeer even in the forefront of it. You also see the caravan of cars coming up on the road. He sort of was able to unite this into a vision. It's also, if you take a little closer look, a northern Italian town. It's Siena, isn't it? Protected with a city wall. No vineyards outside, but certainly other economic features. This is the new edition, actually, of my dissertation. It's in Swedish, unfortunately. It's been reissued, not very common for a doctoral dissertation. Why is that? Because there is this discussion. Perhaps this is also the reason I'm standing here today, that this book is very much discussed now. There's an interest to find out more facts, both about the present time and the future, but also about the past, because this is a historical work. Before I go into that, into my results of that research, let me just say a couple of other things. This is a very common thing that you see in your work, I suppose, more or less every day. You look at, this is gross regional product per capita divided by the Swedish regions. And the darker the color, the higher the regional product. This is very high in this part of Sweden. It's among the richest, so to speak, regions, if you look at those numbers, together with Stockholm and West Sweden with Gothenburg. People here often have asked themselves, what do we get in return for this? And if the green industrialization will happen as planned, this color will be even darker. And the acuteness of this question will grow even more. What do we get in return? We who already live here. Be they Sami, be they local residents of other origins. Another graphic representation is this one. It's again by regions in Sweden. It's the share of greenhouse gas emissions, if you look at the dark bar. And of course, the largest region, Stockholm, Western Götaland, is still the leading there, with Malmö also in the south. But then comes Norrbotten, because of the steel industry here. It's of course very important to bring that down. So the logic of the green transition is very, very clear. The other bars, they are about number of employees and also the share of GDP. These are much smaller, of course, but the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions and other indicators is a bit stark for this region. So there is a logic. But let's return also to the bigger picture. We need to do this without adding to the Anthropocene, without adding to pressure on the planet. And you've all seen probably by now these hockey stick curves from the early 2000s. It was a remarkable, I think, achievement of both the social sciences and the natural science to come together in this description of the world as we see it, putting more and more pressure. And what we need to do is, of course, to reduce that pressure. That again speaks to the logic of the green transition. And the graphic down to the left there is the so-called planetary boundaries diagram, critical zones in many of the parameters that we are now on the brink of actually moving beyond, crossing them, and creating an even more dangerous situation on the planet. And just to remind you, this is the Earth system trends. This is how they are driven by societal development, economic growth, and so on. The logic is obvious. This is the most recent step in this evolution of thinking around planetary boundaries. It was just a couple of weeks ago in the Academy of Sciences in Stockholm. Johan Rockström, a well-known name, I think, to most of you, was there to present that paper, published in Nature the same day. And now introducing aspects of safety and justice into the equation, and using so-called donut economics to illustrate that. It's illustrated here. Look at climate, for example. The outer boundary is around 1.5 degrees, the brown color there, that you shouldn't exceed or transgress if you want to stay safe for the planet. But if you want to stay safe for the people who inhabit the planet, those who are affected most, for example, reindeer herders, or for example, people around the Mediterranean, which are going to already experience very high temperatures, you need to even bring it down further. 1.5 isn't enough. The safety boundary is 1 degree. And the same could be done for other parameters. We don't have the time to run through phosphorus and nitrogen and so on here. But this is the logic of it all. We need to reduce it. Otherwise, the planet is disturbed profoundly. We also need to look what's going on in the world. We are, in a sense, unique in this part of the world to some extent, but many similar things happen in other places. These kinds of big projects have been studied by Martin Arboleda in a book that I really would recommend everybody to read, The Planetary Mine. There are thousands of these projects. And if you look for the reasons to what is happening in this hockey stick curve that you just saw, this is part of it. It's a very important part of it. Resources are taken out, and they will still be taken out, even with green transitions. So as already was said in the previous panel, you need to do both here. You need to both transition to the green, bring down emissions, but you also need to scale down on the circulation of material. That's the big, big super challenge for this coming century. This is Alberta, the tar sands. It looks like this. A Nobel laureate could almost a century ago say that we cannot destroy the world. God has built in his, fool-proof mechanisms that make it impossible. Well, I wish we had that God, but I don't think we have it. This is the way it looks here. Some people live underneath these turbines. So I've read your background paper for this conference. Fantastic contribution. Thank you very much for that. But already there you can see the problem is not to see the logic here. The problem is to what happens on the ground, how to actually make everybody fit into this pattern when we want to progress forward. On the ground, people are protesting what is going on. They may ask questions like, what is the use of to use a mine for 15 or 20 years when the end result might be the end of a culture in that part of the country? And that's some representatives saying, that's also Greta Thunberg saying. Again, nothing unique. You find that all over the world. And some of those who argue against mining have a certain kind of opinion. Other miners, like coal miners in the United States, they vote Trump because they precisely want to keep their industry. These are social tensions that come in processes like the ones we are entering into here. And it's just to think about them and deal with them and dialogue about them. The main results in my dissertation were these. The North have been producing futures for 500 years. Industrialization was very much about what is the future we want, not just what is the future that needs to happen deterministically. It was also about polarization. It was a period of conflicts growing and around natural resources and how they were going to be used, and also a scientization. Scientists were called upon from the fighting camps in the political debate to support their position, and both camps found their scientific supporters, I can tell you. This is the future, going back 16th century map. Wonderful things. These are the industrialists to the right, one of the most prominent of those in the paper and lumber industry. On the left-hand side was one of the most vocal critics of the development, who became very popular among the Sami already a century ago. And you see him also carrying a placard there in the middle. His name was Carl Lindhagen. Franz Kempe was the one to the right, who had many industries himself. And here are the scientists that produced pamphlets and brochures to support their various camps in the debate. It was very fascinating. It's all in that dissertation. It was great to see the correspondence about these things. Also the novels, the artwork, or artists engaged, mostly on the critical side. They critiqued the forest companies already then for their clear-cutting strategies or for dubious business practices. One very important thing to keep in mind here is that, it's already been pointed out, it's not a very densely populated region. So the kind of economy that existed before big industry came in was diffuse, it was spread out. Both the Sami economy, as we've already heard, but also the forest-based agrarian economy was also diffused. They had their grazing lands for cows way out in the forest, and they collected hay in marginal places, and there was also some slash and burn, although not so much as in Finland. And again, authors who argue that we should build the big industries, they are the future, and other artists, photographers, and authors who said, even in fairly recently, in the late years of the previous century, that argue that we should be careful and cautious. We should be when we move into this. Here is the Umeå-based photographer Sune Jonsson, who won the Hasselblad Prize, a very prominent. He often went back to these kinds of environments where people have settled and formed a farm and built a living, and then photographed these young boys when they were grown-up men. There was nothing left. They had left. There are many places in this region that have been left. The question, what did we get in return, is always there here. It's something to keep in mind. I would like to point to three stylized development paradigms to summarize this long history. First, we had this industrialization 1.0. It was based on this diffusion of population and a company town urbanization that centered mostly around mines, but also to some extent around a lumber industry. It was pursued in a situation that was very different in a sense. There was a surplus of labor. Many people, 1 million people from Sweden went mostly to America or South Africa, other countries, as migrants. Some small share of that could be funneled off to go north, and there was not really a shortage of labor. In a later period, well into the 20th century, you see a structural change, particularly the forest industry didn't need it. It was mechanized. Not many people was needed in that industry anymore. So we see a further concentration of the population. And we see also public investment in education, in public health, in elderly care, research, and the cultural sector. The state was very active. And then we move into the current situation with green new industrialism, an accelerated, as it seems, concentration to a fairly small number of places with big investments, and an expanded and intensified extractivism. This is not a dematerialized economy. We're going to have much more freight, bigger harbors, more material. So it's this paradox built into the situation. Where it will end, when it will end, I don't know. It's starting now. I want to point to this. The state in the 20th century was bigger than it is now. We already heard that from the stage. So much responsibility is rolled out, sort of deferred to communities and to regions. The state took a more active role. We have a long history of democracy, investment in popular education, national radio, 9-year schooling system, soon 12 years. We had a coalition government that formed a unity around how to look at the labor market, to move forward together under social peace with little strikes in Sweden. We had social insurance systems introduced. We also had a crisis inquiry into the north that had problems already after the war, and an active policy to somehow strengthen the regions was introduced and lived on for several decades, actually. I call this the welfare contract. You could be in the north. You could live in the north as a private person, and you can invest in it as a company, for example, because this support system was guaranteed, so to speak, from above. And here is what you could get with this welfare contract: a northern investment, infrastructures, the service institutions. It was introduced also a tax redistribution system, so that where they were richer, so to speak, in the big cities in the south, they funneled off a little bit of that money to sustain life in the regions. You could call this a systemic national solidarity, an idea maybe to keep as we move along here now. It was de-risking investment and development in the north, and it also was aiming to achieve an equal standard of living in different regions. This is now facing up against this bigger global problems of what we may call Anthropocene scarcity, that really put the limits on what we do. So that's the kind of new equation that was not heard of in the 1980s or earlier. And I would like to suggest to you that the kinds of political tensions that I investigated in the 1980s and that were playing out in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, I think, my projection is that they will now come back in a new version. I think it's already started. And some of the templates of how to look at this can be found in this Anthropocene debate kind of situation. Some are the eco-modernists. They represent a certain more resource-oriented take. Others critique them for just being another version of capitalism. That's too binary. It's not like that, I think. It's a little bit more nuanced. And here is what I suggest as what we see as the kind of proto-politics of the new North Green transition. And again, very stylized. And let me just quickly walk you through these points. There is a mainstream, I think, way of thinking about the ongoing transition. It should be green, it should be global. It's a narrative that's been very strong already since about, I'd say, 5 years for the north of Sweden. It's very much SDG based to the 17 goals. It's also very much linked to the gospel of the sustainable development. So it's somehow, it stays juste milieu, it stays nice. There's a radical version of that, which is precisely eco-modernist. It argues very strongly for even more of the nuclear, of electrification. It has nothing really against more raw material expansion. It argues supply-side economics, and it insists on technology as the solution to almost any problem. There's a neoliberal critique of this that has come up in this country in the last couple of years, which I find very interesting. In that strand, ideological strand, there is, of course, an inbuilt mistrust of the state, not least if the state owns the companies, which is the case in the north of Sweden, particularly Norrbotten. They would rather see a much more market-driven, almost solely market-driven development, and particularly they like entrepreneurs. They have an urban focus and they have a new technologies focus, and it's very often southern. With the lack of energy in this electric energy in this part of the country, well, there's a lot, but it's too little to fulfill the visions of what you need for the future industries. They say, this is too scarce. Why should we privilege the north? Maybe we need more of energy, electric energy in the south. That is a new voice in the last couple of years. Then we have a strand which we could call dark green, light red, perhaps, with a stronger minorities support orientation. Insists very much on international solidarity. Solidarity is a key word in this strand of the debate. It argues not so much for more delivery of materials and energy. It rather argues effectivization and conservation. Some of that you hear also from Brussels these days. So there's a new interesting symbiosis or repercussion between this strand and Brussels orthodoxy. And it's very much a transformation narrative, not just a transition narrative. And then we have the dark blue, also growing quickly in this country, as in many others around Europe these days. It has a very, very weak orientation towards the minorities. I would say even the disregard minorities. There's a Sweden first focus. It's rural, it's people first. Environment, climate, low priority. And it's a weak transition narrative. That's my take on what we see now, what's going on. I don't think it will stop here. This discussion will go on. It's very, very good that we have this discussion. It's democratic, it's necessary. And I think it will help take your position paper, already very good, further to deal with the kind of contradictions that is inbuilt in this process. And I wish you the best of luck with this conference. Thank you.